So, hello everybody, and welcome to this debate on the COVID-19 and its impact on media freedom. My name is Urška Umek, and I head the media unit at the Council of Europe. The Council is a human rights organization, and our concern in this, or indeed in any crisis, is how it will affect the established human rights standards and what it will mean for the exercise of rights and freedoms enshrined in the European Convention on Human Rights. In this particular case, we will be discussing the crisis impact on freedom of expression and media freedom. But before we delve into the question, I would like to invite Mr. Patrick Pennings, our Head of Information Society Department here at the Council of Europe, to say a few words of welcome. Hello, Patrick.
Thank you so much, Urška, and welcome to you all. Welcome to all the participants to this Council of Europe seminar. I'm very happy to be able to discuss and listen specifically to all of the panelists, which have us coming from very diverse backgrounds. Alexandra, Denis, Kolo, Mariana, Marco, Oksana, and Maya, and thank you for having accepted also our invitation. In my very short intro, because the real thing is really what you're going to be saying, but in my very short intro, I would like to focus on three words, that is trust, restrictions, and fragility. We all need information we can trust, especially in these times, and media rely and sources rely on good information. Media plays a vital role, and media actors need the freedom to gather and publish all relevant information. That is exactly when media players are confronted with a number of restrictions of access to information and public, but also are confronted with adverse reactions. And that brings us to the third element, which is fragility. There is increased threats and violence to journalists. There is a threat of disinformation, and there's also an increasing threat due to the financial situation in which media outlets and also journalists themselves find themselves. So I'm really eager to listen to what you're all going to be saying from your different perspectives on this issue. Thank you so much for participating.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Yes, indeed, just as you said, it is crucial. Media is crucial for how we right now understand this whole health crisis, and it is critical actually for our health and safety at this moment. So not surprisingly, I think that I have read analysis that media consumption is up in most countries. People are once again prioritizing actually media, established media news sources over online sources. But that is not reflected, as Patrick said, in the financial situation. And also, the work of the media has been made harder by lockdown measures, in some cases emergency laws, and even in some cases governments seem to be using the situation to attempt to silence critical voices. So freedom of expression and information is facing big challenges, but how can in these circumstances committed journalists and media live up to their role of public watchdog and, as we like to say, the cornerstone of democracy? Are there also opportunities to be seized from this crisis? And what kind of help do journalists and media need from states, international community, also international organizations such as ours? So we will be exploring this with today's panelists. Alexandra Borja. She's a journalist, book author, journalism professor, and media advisor who currently works as a consultant for the World Association of News Publishers, and she also heads Digital Journalism Fellowship at the Hamburg Media School. At the Council of Europe, she's a member of the Committee of Experts on Freedom of Expression and Digital Technologies. Coloretto Zuccalli has worked since 2000 in various radio, TV, print, and online media. He has been a columnist for daily newspapers and new media, and he's also a filmmaker. Since 2017, Kola serves as the head of Albanian Media Council, a self-regulatory body enforcing standards of journalistic ethics. Then we've got Mariam Gogosashvili, who is Executive Director of the Georgian Charter of Journalistic Ethics. Mariam worked previously at Georgia Young Lawyers Association as a media law project coordinator, and she was also a lawyer at their Media Legal Defense Center. Then we have got Oksana Romaniuk, who is the Executive Director of the Kiev-based Institute of Mass Information. The IMI is a leading Ukrainian NGO that researches mass information in modern society. But Oksana is also a member of the Commission of Journalist Ethics of Ukraine, and she is Ukraine's representative of Reporters Without Borders. Then we've got Denis Suleiman, who's a project coordinator and communications officer at the Association of Journalists of Macedonia. And he has rich experience working for non-governmental organizations. So he's now managing journalism projects, supporting media freedom and democratization processes in North Macedonia. And last but definitely not least, we have got Maja Vasic-Nikolic, who is a project manager at the Independent Journalist Association of Serbia. She's developing and implementing a regional project focused on strengthening capacities of journalist associations of the Western Balkans to be effective advocates for media freedom and safety of journalists. So these are our panelists today. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you. And without further ado, I would like to ask you something rather general that will no doubt resonate with all of you. So how has COVID-19 changed the work of journalists? How is it affecting media reporting? If we just start with one example, the news gathering process, lockdown, social distancing measure, they have certainly affected how journalists can access information. So perhaps we start with Mariam, with you. Hello, Mariam.
Hello. Thank you so much for this invitation. I think it's extremely important that we have this opportunity and we discuss media challenges following the rapid spread of COVID-19. Nowadays, journalists and media outlets have to handle a lot of challenges. This kind of situation and such kind of challenges negatively affect the exercise of media freedom and freedom of expression. For example, in Georgia, according to the emergency law, freedom of expression is not directly restricted, but there are several limitations that affect freedom of expression. Among them are limited access to public information and restriction freedom of movement. When journalists have not access to the public information, this means that they lost their main function to have watchdog function, and also they can't even get some information, get some information about COVID-19. Also, here is forbidden to move on the streets in Georgia from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. There was a time when it was forbidden to drive a car. Journalists only had approximately 4 or 5 hours to take special permissions. It's notable that restrictions are sometimes tightened, but journalists no longer have the opportunity to obtain special permits. Nowadays, media have other challenges as well. They work remotely. In my point of view, to switch to teleworking without much advance notice is a challenge for any worker, but more so for journalists. Current production is highly collaborative process, and it's very difficult to integrate our home workstations with the central studio. Also, journalists need to protect themselves, and they also need to be alert about the symptoms and know what to do if they develop them. In Georgia, we have another challenge because Journalists also need to protect their family members as well, because here multi-generational households are still common. We have several guidelines by National Center for Disease Control, WHO, how to act step by step to protect ourselves. I'm not sure that all journalists follow all the rules, but we have no confirmed case of a journalist. Also, journalists have to avoid professional burnout, and the main point is that they have some ethical challenges, because everything about COVID-19, so they need to study how to tell stories, how to interview safety and with empathy, where to find these stories, how to fact check information, because this information is very increased today. So I think journalists should manage these ethical challenges, and start working and start to study how to work with COVID-19. This is very briefly what I wanted to say about the problems and challenges of journalists. If you have any questions, I can answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mariam. This was already, yes, indeed, very complete picture of how journalists work in Georgia and what kind of challenges they're meeting. So challenging in terms of access, challenges in terms of working in very different conditions, home stations, etc., but also balancing work and family life. Maybe continue with Kola.
Yes, thank you everybody for being here. I mean, everybody got hit by COVID, but here we had the media had two main problems. The first were virus-made problems, and the rest was man-made problems. So initially, the virus hit very bad in the sense that businesses during the lockdown, businesses were closed, so the financial support through advertising for many media fell immediately. Unfortunately, we live in a country without proper data, so all the data you can use, I mean, cannot be held as guidelines for what is happening. But I've been told that the revenues fell to 30%. So that was a hard hit, and it hit mostly the press. We witnessed a couple of newspapers who closed for good. Also, the new media. The new media works on monthly basis revenue, so they need the revenue for this month to pay salaries and to keep going on. So most of them either didn't pay anymore their journalists or started to lay down stuff. Even big televisions, which were supposed to manage to hold better, they didn't, indeed. And most of them started laying down stuff and cutting wages. This directly impacted the quality of information. But this was not the worst part. The worst part, as I told you, were the human problems we had here, because at the moment that the lockdown started, we witnessed a very aggressive stance of the government towards media. So 10 days prior to lockdown, our government was attacking media for spreading an infodemic and for lying on the risks of the epidemics. 10 days later, totally reversed. Total lockdown, and the Prime Minister went out with a voice message to all Albanians. I would say it's sort of a forced message, because it was sent to every cell phone of every Albanian with a smartphone, who said specifically, an audio message who said, wash your hands, refresh your air in the room, and don't trust the media. So it was explicitly, and this is not, it's hard to believe, but this is the attitude of this prime minister for many years now. The worse he's faring in governing this country, the most he's trying to make out an enemy. So this warlike attitude we got here, we even witnessed it, tanks in the streets of the capital, Tirana. To my perception, of course, you can call the army, but it's to help people, where the other structures cannot go to aid to people. You use the army to distribute help or whatever, but it doesn't mean that I mean, it started as a war on COVID and ended in a war against trespassers. And the media was included in that. So it started like that. Then continuously we already have had lowering standards of transparency of the government. But the lockdown and the state of natural disaster gave them the opportunity to totally obscure any kind of information. I explain. We never had, even once, a press conference in the country. Just declarations. Media tried to pose questions via email or whatever, or WhatsApp, but none of those questions was taken in consideration. We just heard everyday declarations by the state authorities.
If I may,
I would say that, yeah, please.
Yeah, if I may cut in just a little bit, and we will continue about this topic just a little, but because the issue of presence at press conferences and accessing official information seems to be something that is not a unique problem in Albania. It has happened, I think, in several states. Maya, could you perhaps elaborate? Is that also the case in Serbia?
Yes, hello. Indeed, that was the case in Serbia, whereas on the first attempt of our government to restrict or centralize the flow of information was when the Prime Minister decided that only the crisis response team can gather, collate, and disseminate information of public interest, meaning that basically nobody apart from the members of this team are allowed to give out information, and any media that actually reports anything from a person who is not in the team could be liable for criminal charges for spreading this information. This particular measure was taken out, I think, 3 days after the big reaction from Serbia and abroad, but only 10 days later, the government decided to stop having press conferences, or to have press conferences without the press. And this has caused quite a bit of worry, because we were wondering why was this decision made. And there are many interpretations, but I think most of the media experts and journalists agree that actually these press conferences that took place and that were broadcasted on television stations with national frequency, it was the first time that some of the independent media who ask questions that are in public interest were given floor. And all of a sudden, the media that are usually portrayed as enemies of the state, or people who want to murder the president, and, you know, with some labels like fascists, etc., were given floor, and people around Serbia could hear that they're actually asking questions in public interest. And some say that this became a worry, and all of a sudden they decided, due to health concerns that some media complained about, that they should close the press conferences, although we spoke to media associations and individual media and nobody reported any types of this kind of concerns. They decided to introduce sending questions via email until half an hour before the press conference. These questions were sent, somebody decided which one will be read out, and the crisis team just read the answers. Now, just to give a little bit of context here, we actually did a survey amongst journalists in Serbia to find out whether they use these press conferences. And indeed, 180 journalists responded that they did. And we asked, did you get any answers that actually have enough data that you can provide to the citizens information of public interest? And 95% of our respondents said that information that is provided in press conferences like this does not give the citizens information they need with regards to their health and safety. This measure, again, after the comments from the Council of Europe and other international organizations was withdrawn, only to allow one day you will have agencies and online media, the other day you will have print and electronic media, and then soon as the state of emergency that was declared was eased down and the press conferences stopped. But I have to highlight one thing. This particular measure seems to be applied only to the press conferences of the crisis response unit, because many other press events by the President Vučić were not subjected to this health measure, i.e. many journalists were present not respecting the rules, the social distancing, wearing the safety masks, etc. So we do wonder what was the main purpose of this measure. Maybe for now, because we have lots of interesting examples in Serbia, I will keep it short. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I was actually going to ask, because indeed you journalists need official information. You need information from government sources, and they have the means and the tools to obviously obtain such information up to date about the numbers of infected persons, deaths, precautionary measures, etc., etc. But on the other hand, of course, you also fact check the government. So there must be some sort of a means of how to use official information versus information that is, let's say, independently obtained. This relates back to ethics. Perhaps, I don't know, Alexandra, would you have something to say on that, the use of sources during the COVID crisis?
Yes, hi. Thank you for asking me. I always like to take a little bit of an optimistic stance, and obviously it's easy to be an optimist when you live in Germany, but actually everyone else who spoke up already demonstrated how hard it is in many countries. But I see this crisis really as an opportunity for journalism to build trusting relationships with their audiences. Again, also with their audiences that have been told by their respective governments, actually you are not supposed to trust the media, as you were told before. And now is the time really to serve audiences and to serve them with the content they need, the information they need. And luckily there are international bodies that collect information that can be mirrored or that can be compared to the official government information in countries where, this kind of official information might not always be transparent. But I mean, even think about it, think about the United States, where the president, proclaims that, you should inject bleach or, take certain medicine, whatever. So the role of journalists is not only to go to press conferences and dutifully report, obviously, what your officials are saying, but really to make their audiences trust them again and to make them their allies. I mean, this is really what journalism is actually about, to be allies of the citizens. And once citizens regain trust, and, the situation now is to make your citizens, make your readers or listeners or viewers to regain trust again, then you can actually work with citizens, because then they'll trust you. They'll tell you, what their needs are and what local circumstances might be that are really important in making judgments on the situation. And the more you do that, the less you rely on official government information. And as I said, that's not only necessary in countries with a with a tradition of more authoritarian interpretations of democracy or anything else, but also in countries like the United States or other countries that actually, used to have thriving democracy. So it is really important to build these alliances, to be there for the audiences that you need to serve. And now is the time, but actually it's also a great urgency, because in the first weeks of lockdowns and all other imposed restrictions, really demand for independent journalism went up everywhere. People were even, subscribing they were buying digital subscriptions to get more information, trusted information, independent information. But actually, the first studies that are published now, they indicate that interest is actually going down. People start to avoid news because, they feel burned out a little, they feel tired, there's too much information. And it really affects their mood, and also they have other responsibilities. They have, to take care of their kids, their families, working remotely, in their breadwinner job. They have maybe worries about losing their jobs whatsoever. So if newsrooms have missed out on building that trust, now it will get harder and harder to do that. So now these are crucial weeks now to really build trust with your audiences.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Alexandra. Oksana, how does this resonate perhaps in the Ukrainian context? Also, this interesting phenomenon of moving from the wish or the need for information to perhaps some sort of slight fatigue, because we do sometimes feel indeed that there's too much information. What are the key issues that are raised in Ukraine in this respect?
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for organizing this discussion, because I think it's very important to raise these issues. We are witnessing, I think, the rebuilding of the media sphere. And actually, I agree with what Alexandra has said. I would add three main dimensions that we have witnessed here in Ukraine. First is the challenge, of course, to the freedom of expression. My colleagues from other countries have already mentioned it. I would add here physical aggression, because in Ukraine we had situations when journalists tried to check how quarantine is observed, for instance, in some local restaurants, whatever, churches, and they literally were beaten. And second challenge to physical aggression was restriction to the access to information under the pretext of quarantine. When local authorities just blocked journalists, they carried out sessions, but they didn't allow journalists. Because quarantine, we take care about your health, dear journalists. So second dimension is that media have become more dependent on media owners. We have system of media oligarchs in Ukraine, and because of the huge drop in advertising, like up to 50% in Ukraine, we have witnessed media became more dependent financially on media oligarchs, on politicians who are ready to pay, for hidden political advertising. And this is, of course, very worrying. This really hit independent media. And yes, we, from the beginning of the quarantine, we have witnessed the 20% of growth of audience. But because media were sometimes forced to serve the interests of media oligarchs, I think it will hit the trust of people to media, and they will turn to maybe getting information from social platforms, whatever. I think this is very crucial for media today to think about other ways of managing this crisis, about paywalls, about donations, about some other ways to engage financial support to address their audience, whatever. but to really keep this trust. And one more little problem that we have witnessed is, I don't know about other countries, but in Ukraine, like over 50% of content of media is devoted to COVID-19. Like nothing else happens in political life, economical life. There are really many challenges connected with economical crisis. And there are a lot of questions about that. There are a lot of questions, really social important questions about the development of the country. But yes, we just place information about the coronavirus and really pay less and less attention to other developments of the country, because the information about COVID, it receives high attention from audience. However, now everybody is a little bit fed up, but I think we should also raise this issue that we lost some really important topics out of our attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oksana. Yes, this is really interesting, sort of almost a pretext, even though probably not intentional, to neglect very important topics for the country that are not COVID related. But before we go into that, because I would also like to ask you all a question on disinformation. One other thing is safety at work, which you have mentioned, physical aggression when doing your job. It is not only that, and Denis, I would like to ask you, because I think your association engaged very much in making journalists safe when doing their job. Can you comment on that for start? Thanks.
Yes. Hello, everyone. As you said, we since the beginning of the pandemic, we immediately tried to, as you said in your introduction, to make possible for journalists to live up to their role. So that meant that we would need to secure journalists while working on the field, because we knew that our profession is like that we will be very exposed to the virus due to the nature of the work. So in this regard, we, in cooperation with the OSCE mission in Skopje, we provided medical protective equipment for over 130 media outlets in the country. The equipment was distributed to them in packages, so it was, I would say, a big help for the media, for the journalists, and for the media workers, because especially at the beginning of the pandemic, it was quite difficult to buy medical equipment. We had I would say a lack of equipment, of medical protective equipment in the stores. Also, regarding the reporting for the pandemic itself, we created, in cooperation with the Council of Media Ethics in Macedonia, we created a publication titled Guidelines for Safe and Professional Reporting on Coronavirus. In the publication, the first part of the publication basically offers a guidance on ethical, professional, and responsible reporting on coronavirus in a situation of global pandemic. While the second part of the publication was a kind of protocol for the protection and self-protection of journalists and media workers during the pandemics. I would say, like the other countries, we also faced some problems with the restrictions. In general, we had two issues that we faced. The first problem was that the government basically restricted the right to ask questions for journalists who were not part of the Register of Professional Online Media, which is created by us and the Council of Media Ethics, and for journalists which are not part of the media which is registered in the Agency of Audio and Audiovisual Media Services. So this means that freelance journalists and journalists which were not part of these media outlets could not ask questions. Also, regarding the curfew and the movement of journalists, the government made the same decision. So again, journalists who are not part of the media registered in the register and in the Agency of Audio and Audiovisual Media Services could not go out on the field during the curfew and record news. So I see here, and I would like to ask, I would like to add an answer. One of the colleagues in the chat asked about the support, probably the financial support for the media, and when the crisis began, the government made a measure to help the private businesses by giving them the minimal salary, like a subsidy for each employee in the amount of the minimal salary. So our association and the union asked this measure to be implemented also for the media. So with this, the media basically got subsidized for each employee in the amount of the minimal salary. Yeah.
Maybe just stop here for the second. Meanwhile, also our seventh panelist has managed to join us. Welcome, Marko Milosavljević. He's an associate professor of journalism at the Faculty of Social Sciences at University of Ljubljana, Slovenia. He's also advising the European Commission on Media and Culture. He is chairing the Communications Law and Policy section of the European Communications Research and Education Association, and he also is a member of an expert committee here at the Council of Europe, expert committee on media, environment and reform. And I will throw Marko right into the debate, and I will ask him a question that in some way perhaps tries to summarize some of the thoughts of our other panelists. I would like to know whether you think, Marko, that journalists should be treated as essential workers in times of crisis and should also be given certain rights or exemptions, derogations in terms of freedom of movement, in terms of curfews, to be able to do their job effectively. To start with that, for example. Hello, Marko. Marko?
He's muted.
Mm-hmm. All right.
All right. Can you?
Yeah. Hello. Hello.
Hello. Yes, I guess I muted myself when I joined, not to disturb you, but of course I forgot to unmute myself. So yes, that is indeed an important question, an important aspect, because I find here a nice parallel with the way media and journalists are treated in terms of power. Namely, we often refer to the media as the fourth estate and as a sort of fourth branch of power. But on the other hand, we all know that the media doesn't have legal power. Media is a sort of power without responsibility, to quote an old British Prime Minister. And I think that here we have a similar situation. We have media and journalists performing an extremely important job for whole societies and countries, as can be seen within the previous months within the COVID situation throughout the world. We see journalists who are actually having a great public responsibility, who performed their duties and tasks in spite of all the obstacles, in spite of all the dangers also to their health, and bringing this very important information to the public. And in this aspect, it seems to me clear that the media, of course, need a special position. Perhaps it is not, it should not be enshrined in a way in a, let's say, constitution or some other systems, But I think as just like we agree that media is the fourth estate, that it performs some sort of supervisory watchdog function in spite of the fact that it doesn't have legal power, I think that the media should have a clear exemption from curfews and from other aspects, of course, when it comes to performing their duties. If a journalist is just going for a visit somewhere and breaking the curfew, that is another thing. But if a journalist is performing a journalistic duty, if a journalist, for example, is chairing or leading a TV news and then returning home, and then the police stops that journalist, I think it would be completely inappropriate to say that that journalist was breaching the curfew. He was or she was performing a very significant publicly responsible role. So I think that this is it is and it should be clear. Of course, then we are always facing with the fact that a lot of the sources of the power very often don't acknowledge that or don't recognize that. Now that is a completely different aspect, but I think that the general public is aware that the media and journalists were performing an extremely important task, that they were helping people to identify the threats, to know what to do, even in times when some political figures were not actually behaving really responsibly or distributing actually fake news from different sides. We all know, for example, here in the Balkans, when one of the health sort of experts claimed that this is just not just some sort of flu, but it's a sort of fake news, and that women should simply go shopping and use that to go shopping in Italy, which was, of course, also an inappropriate remark. But it's often seen that the politicians who we trust that will give a responsible information were not giving responsible information. And the media were often the ones, and journalists who were checking that and actually giving the public the information from the experts, from international research, and so on and so on.
Thank you, Marko. Yes, it seems that media has a huge promise to fulfill, while at the same time being subject to various attacks, and quite often coming from the government side as well. One of the things we rely on the media to do is also to counter disinformation, to debunk. And I'm just wondering, because we all know that World Health Organization has called this particular health crisis not only a pandemic but also an infodemic. How is the media responding to disinformation or addressing it? For example, in your countries, Kolo, maybe start with you about this.
I would like just to finish where we were at before, because there is something, important to share with you. Mm-hmm. So, as I was telling you, we started with a voice message, beware of the media. And last week we had another act from the government trying to close a whole TV station because they were in one of the studios, talk shows they were hosting, the hygienic anti-COVID measures were not proper, so they fined and they tried to close the whole TV station. And this thing was happening 3 days before the lockdown was totally lifted and all the measures were all taken off, Mm-hmm. So in the last week, they were doing this. Fortunately, the reaction was very, very, very brave and they stepped down. But this was the apotheosis of the aggressive stance of the government against media. As for what you were asking, as I was telling you here, the flow of information was very centralized, so there was basically nothing to report. So the what could be like conspiracy theories or unverified information circulating was mostly imported, or I would say 99% imported. So all the conspiracy theories that were circulating in mostly in Western media were also translated and published here. So I don't have an idea how to tackle on that.
Right.
I suppose it was a global situation and problem, because when you report on a deputy of a parliament of a European country spreading personally and believing these conspiracy theories, you report it. I mean, but you cannot verify or check it.
Yeah.
So, but the media was an easy prey on that. They try to manage, I mean, to reach for meaningful sources, but you could not do it all the time. And what is a meaningful and verified source from abroad? So you never know that.
Yes, that is a question.
Whatever was going on in Europe came down here. So we translated all of that crap.
I suppose it's very difficult also to know when to even address something and to debunk it, or will you therefore, by mentioning it, sort of spread it and give it some extra value, and some more people might even believe in that. I don't know, is that also, Oksana, is that in Ukraine also the case? Have you had problems such as this, and did media manage to, or let me even rephrase, does anybody has experience where also the media would actually be propagating disinformation?
Actually, in Ukraine, this is mostly the problem at two levels. First, in social networks, we have seen really a huge wave of disinformation about COVID-19 spread in social networks. And the second is pro-Russian media. We also tried to involve experts who say that like COVID was invented in the United States or something like that. Generally, the normal media, they like independent media, they reported with fact-checking. However, there was a problem with emotions. They really tried to turn more attention of audience, and they manipulated, unfortunately, with the contents, with emotions, that like everybody will die or something like that. And there have been some initiatives to combat the fake news and to develop media literacy in Ukraine. The initiatives mostly by NGOs and supported by some media. Today, one of leading media in Ukraine, Ukrainska Pravda, they launched Pravda Source resource to it will be devoted solely to the information about COVID-19, about fact-checking, etc. And IMI, my organization, we launched a contest for general public. We call it Catch a Fake. And we ask people to catch fakes and to prepare debunking and to send it to us, and we will choose the winners. It's very popular among people involved, like among school children, among students. And I think it may be an idea for colleagues from other countries to carry out such like interactive things, because if you debunk fakes only with text, unfortunately it's not that influential. You have to prepare some, I don't know, some different activity to turn attention maybe, but fakes is really the problem.
Thank you, Oksana. Yes, indeed, and you've mentioned an important thing. Yes, Alexandra has also something to comment on, how media and information literacy tools can be very helpful. But now I give word to Alexandra, of course.
Yes, I mean, this whole situation actually has showed me personally how fragmented our information environment is, because I personally haven't gotten a single bit or piece of fake news, misinformation on my channels, but obviously lots of other people have. For example, my parents, through friends and acquaintances who send around these WhatsApps or whatever messages, Telegram messages seem to be very popular on that thing. So it is really hard to tackle that when, as a journalist, this stuff is not necessarily out in the open. You can't really get it unless you get it. But what I actually always recommend is, because really you already said that, Urška, amplification is a huge problem. What I recommend newsrooms is don't waste all your energy on debunking misinformation, fake news, because you might run the risk to amplify it, but really develop strong news yourself, and you should be setting the agenda, not let others set the agenda. And for example, in Germany, the strongest piece of content in this whole crisis was a podcast with a renowned virologist who has studied actually coronaviruses for the major part of his career. And he actually, in the beginning, they ran a daily podcast on public service news on NDR with him. And these podcasts ran up to like 45 minutes, an hour, and the editor who invented that and who was responsible for that just recently told me that actually most people stayed until the end. And funnily, my own mother, who said like, I always get these fake messages, so I listen to that podcast by Christian Drosten because then I feel I'm on the safe side, and I look at the website of the public health agency. So I found that really funny. And yeah, this guy, Christian Drosten, he became a real star in Germany with all the, advantages and disadvantages of stardom, because then suddenly people wanted to get rid of this guy because he's preventing us from opening up our businesses again. And then, he changes his mind, how dare he? Because this is what science is all about. I mean, he's a virologist, so, he got new insights every day. So he changed, his perspective on certain things. But this really is so important. I'm just mentioning this as really important to develop some strong piece of content that people really like to listen to or to read, or that they trust, which is much more important than, debunking all kinds of misinformation that's floating around just anywhere.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Alexandra. Maya, how has this happened in Serbia? How have independent media engaged with, I'm sure you've had similar problems than most other countries, a flood of disinformation.
Yes, I wanted to mention one thing about the fake news. As Mark already mentioned previously, it was very kind of odd in Serbia, whereas the chief epidemiologist sitting next to the president announced that this is the funniest virus ever, and that the women should just go shopping to Milan, and that women are more, we have more immunity against the virus. And this is one example of how the disinformation happens in Serbia. This particular doctor is every day on any television with national frequency, giving more completely conflicted information, and he's almost representing the government. So what we have here, and one of the local websites here called the Fake News Tracer, actually did a research on the amount of fake news that are COVID related. And they found out that within 1 month, they had 43 completely fake or manipulative narratives that were reported 241 times in different online and traditional media, but had more than 220,000 reach on social media. And of course, they didn't go on to debunk everything, but actually checked whether this news has remained in the public domain, and only 5% of this fake and misleading content was withdrawn. But what is most worrying here in Serbia is that the actual media that produces and disseminates this fake news are the ones that are directly supported by the state. And this is a big challenge for the independent media, how to fight it. And I was reminded just by what Alexandra was saying about the podcast, that there is one really interesting way for debunking, or to kind of telling people where to search for information, and it turned out to be satire and humor in Serbia, because we have two very not famous yet but popular programs where journalists are actually tackling every day the situation on the ground, but through humor and satire. And I think this is the program that's been viewed online probably the most, and people are out of this despair turning towards these two programs. Unfortunately, as it always is in Serbia, these particular journalists who ran this program are targeted through smear campaigns, receive death threats, called the enemies of the state, but they're just, through humor, asked very simple questions of public interest. So, yes, we have a big problem with disinformation. It's state-sponsored disinformation, probably just to create as much as confusion among the government, because we had state of emergency, which is usually at the time of war, and very similar with what a colleague from Albania was saying, the narrative is always related to war and not to epidemic and health. Yes, difficult to fight against disinformation. Humor turned out to be a very good way to do it. And I have to say that also many independent media reported that citizens are calling them to seek information and turning to this serious media, although the tabloids are the most read and the national frequency TV stations are also tabloid, pro-government. People, when they want to get the information, they go to those, we call them independent, but it's actually professional media that respect the ethical code.
Thank you.
So,
thanks, Maya. Mariam, the situation in Georgia, is there also a core of independent media that people do put their trust in? And how is the government sort of negotiating, let's say, the relationship with media in Georgia? Mariam?
Yes, so now Nino Danelli asked one question, and I will read it, and then I will answer, and I think you will get the answer of your question too. The Georgian government has closed press conferences, and the journalists we asked to turn in written questions so that the government could filter and select convenient ones, so they can left unanswered questions coming from the independent media. And also there is one main issue here that some of government representatives refused to interview to the media outlets who ask critical questions. And today non-governmental organizations and coalitions for media advocacy responded to this issue, and this is the main problem in Georgia, that they don't negotiate with the media outlets who are independent and who ask critical questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, avoiding that is yet another way of relating to the media. So some politicians actually prefer now to use directly social media and communicate in that way. But perhaps to sort of, let's say, recap this whole issue of relationships between governments and the media, Marko, what is, in your view, let's say, an optimum? Because it's always going to be a relationship of slight tension, but what is the optimum solution? How are the governments to respond? And also, how are the media to still address official measures in a respectful manner? Where is the balance to be had in this?
Well, as you know, there is an old English saying that says that if you can't stand the heat, don't go in the kitchen. I think that all the politicians should be aware of this, and I think that a lot of them are aware of this, that being in politics is also being a sort of a target or a topic of criticism. If you cannot stand the criticism in the media and from the public, I think that you're in a wrong profession. So the politicians who believe that the media should only praise them and favor them are, of course, those who obviously don't understand the key role of the media in a democratic society, which is the watchdog function, the function of controlling the government, of watching what it's doing, disclosing the irregularities, as well as, of course, praising the government or praising the politicians or other sources of power when they deserve the praise. And the crisis such as this is, of course, a place where many terrible things happen, and on the other hand, there are also some good things. You have politicians who have responded responsively, who have responded quickly, and who have also given the public services, such as health workers, doctors, police officers, and so on, appropriate equipment, appropriate conditions for work, and so on and so on. And we have all seen the media praising this sort of politicians. For example, the Prime Minister of New Zealand. We have seen praise for politicians from Finland and from many others. And there were all sort of analysis. How come that most of these countries are being led by women? Are they more responsible? Are they more emphatic, and so on? I haven't done an analysis of that, but I have certainly seen praise for politicians when they deserve it. So we need to have media that is, of course, very critical, that is performing the watchdog function, and of course, at the same time, being constructive critical when it comes to these sort of issues. We have seen politicians, including, let's say, in Slovenia, who believed that in times of crisis, the media should be silent. The media should be silent about any sort of mistake, that this is not patriotic, that this is not responsible, and so on and so on. Most of the times, it would be irresponsible for media to be silent, because that could mean endanger the lives of thousands of people if media would not warn about the mistakes, let's say about the safety gear, about the masks, and so on and so on. So that is indeed an important issue to actually have this sort of balance. But on the other hand, as I mentioned, the old English saying, there is also another old English saying about the journalist and the politician, and they say that this is the same relationship as between a dog and a street lamp, which means that, of course, the dog has a special relationship, so to speak, with the street lamp. And if you want to have a sort of, and there is, of course, also a saying in Washington, if you want to have a friend in Washington, buy yourself a dog. So, you know, if you think that the journalist will love you, that the journalist will only praise you, then you're in the wrong profession. You have no knowledge about the political history, about the media history, and so on. I know that it's difficult for some, for their personal characteristics, to simply be responsible, to simply be aware of this, and to have the sort of not so aggressive attitude. As I'm coming from Slovenia, we have seen a lot of aggressive attitude in the last 2 months by the new government and by the Prime Minister, that this has been a topic of criticism by many international organizations as well as international media. But I think it's also important for the journalistic community and the public, of course, to insist on the historical sort of right of the media to be critical.
Thank you very much. And yes, indeed. Perhaps to move to one other topic before we go to the questions, and which has been mentioned before, but I would just like to perhaps have your views on the funding. Obviously, we have seen a paradox of some sort, increased use of the media, which was not really commensurate to the revenues. So the revenues fell, but of course, media was not the only sector that was hard hit by the COVID crisis. That is also to be said. While some states, Finland was mentioned as one of good examples, for example, as to how to negotiate the relationship with media, but also they have support measures. So state support measures are one way of, let's say, circumventing this crisis. What about other necessary or desired measures? I know that this was a sort of pet topic of Alexandra, so I will let her go first, but then perhaps I would also like to hear from some of you what your thoughts are on that. Alexandra.
Hi. Yeah, it's not a pet topic of mine, but obviously, if there's no journalists, then you will have no journalism. So if journalists lose their jobs because, of the business models that are disappearing, then you're in big trouble. And obviously, it's also not a pet topic, but it's something I'm equipped, or I'm prepared to talk about. Whereas everyone else in this room, if you want to call it a room, is much better prepared to talk about political suppression. I think it's a really very important time. This time now is key for publishers, for media companies to really rethink their funding models. It's also a time to convince potential new funders, philanthropists, or big foundations, whatever, to really engage in saving journalism. Because if you don't save it now, you'll see lots of media outlets disappearing. And you can look at the United States, where they don't have these schemes, to keep jobs and give government funding to companies to keep jobs for a longer period of time. They are in big layoff rounds, and lots of news outlets lay off lots of people these days. I mean, it's just really thousands and thousands of jobs. So this is really a dangerous time, a tipping point even for journalism. So what media outlets need to think about now is what is really our core business, our essential business, which means really, as I said before, building up trusting relationships to certain audiences, which also means letting go of things that, they might have been they might have done for decades and decades, but really that don't help to build up these trusting relationships. Letting go of things and stop doing things is really essential, and focus on what's really necessary and important. Obviously, we already talked about digital subscriptions before. We could also call it paywalls, but there's also other models of funding, membership models, for example. The Guardian is really good at that, developing membership models. And in the United States, lots of publishers have been successful, lots of newsrooms asking the public, look, we're actually removing our paywalls now because this COVID-19 coverage is so important to you. But would you be willing to support us with donations, give us money, whatever, because journalism is so important? So that's also a part. It's not like begging for money. It's telling people, look, we have something that's as essential to you as your daily bread and milk and potatoes, whatever. But, this costs money to produce. So, we need your support financially. The most critical part about this, obviously, or as I see it, is that the big platform companies, namely Google and Facebook, they're pouring out millions and hundred millions of money now, euros, dollars, whatsoever, to support journalism, newsrooms, publishers. And disclosure here, I work, two of my major jobs are supported indirectly by these platform companies. So obviously, I'm a profiteer, but it is obviously critical, to really readjust that relationship, because there's a huge power asymmetry. I mean, these platform companies really, they shape a lot what kind of news are seen. They develop the algorithms that determine what kind of content is shown to the public. So actually, it's a love-hate relationship that publishers have to these platform companies. At the same time, they're really pouring out all this money. So that's a most critical point, that these platform companies will gain even more influence. And I'm not saying I don't appreciate that. I think it's important, and it helps newsrooms to innovate and to develop new projects and to experiment with new stuff. But there need to be mechanisms implemented to secure that these projects are run independently from any influence that the platform companies might exert on journalism. So this is actually a critical time for that.
Thanks, Alexandra. Yeah, sorry. Can I just ask Denis something? Because I think that Denis, we broke up just when you were starting to talk about the personal situation, personal financial situation, and measures that were adopted to overcome the crisis. So the minimum wage system. How's that, for example, for freelancers? Because that is something that you were also mentioning. I'm wondering, how are journalists surviving right now, for example, in your country?
Yes, it's a very good question, and it's an issue here because the freelancers could not use this measure. They are not regulated within the law, so they couldn't use it. And we and the union also raised this issue. However, we don't have any positive response regarding it. Regarding the minimal wage, I think it was a good measure to help the media overcome this difficult period. However, there were additional measures which the Agency of Audio and Audiovisual Media Services did for the traditional media, actually for the radios and for the TV stations. They gave back the money which are paid on annual level to the agency. They gave them back to the TV stations and radios. But now we have another issue, which is the online media. They did not receive any kind of help, funding. So we are discussing within our bodies in the association, but also with the other relevant key stakeholders in the country to maybe, because we have elections coming up, so we are trying to find a model which will help the media after the elections in order not to influence on their editorial policy. And with this model, what we are trying to find is a model which will help to projects to create content and to be open for all types of media.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that we need to, unfortunately, there's so many other things that I would like to ask, but because also our participants have been asked to ask questions during the debate, and I see that quite a lot of questions have been submitted here in the chat, and Irina, my colleague, will read out a few, and as much time as we have left, of course, I will ask our panelists to try and answer those questions. Irina, please.
Are there enough journalists who are able to report knowledgeably on data, statistics, health, epidemiology, and similar issues in your countries?
Right, in your countries. So perhaps should we perhaps start with some of our project countries? Maya, for example, are there enough such journalists?
I believe that for the media that that have standards they respect and report professionally, there are. But unfortunately, this is the minority media, and in terms that their reach is very small. So overall, we do have a problem with that, with the media with national frequency and big circulation. But when it comes to those media that respect the code and the public interest, they actually refer quite a lot to the World Health Organization, look for sources outside Serbia in order to provide the current and the most and the safest advice to the citizens. That kind of sums it up.
Thanks. Does anybody have perhaps a different experience that really, I mean, there is solid information, enough science journalists, that there is really good information overflowing the media? Oh, Alexandra raised her hand.
I think there's really excellent science journalism in Germany. And you find, yeah, lots of valuable information, but sometimes, particularly data people, tend to go overboard because they fall in love with these huge, graphics, infographics, data, whatever. And what I found was that actually, since there was so much data on the market, these graphics exploded, but they were actually very confusing to many people because, they didn't tell people that much. Because for example, when you compared death rates and rates of infection, that always depended on really the number of people who were even tested. And I knew, for example, that in the UK, for example, people were not tested to that extent that they were have been tested in Germany. So really, you can't really make these huge, international comparisons. But data journalists love to do these things. And actually, what's really lacking is really, critical analysis of what kind of data makes sense and what kind of data doesn't, and explanations why one might want to switch the terms of reporting or what data one reports. And there are just, I guess, in all Germany, I can't really talk about other countries, but there are just very few journalists who really do an excellent job on that and really explaining why they use this particular data, why this data doesn't tell it. Sometimes even in the science section of the news media, you find, different data, or you find a story that explains data, and then you find data somewhere else in the newspaper on the front page, you find a standard kind of infographic that's sort of contradictory. So it's really very hard because, many journalists are not trained in interpreting data correctly. So that's really something that I guess journalism has to work on also in journalism education.
Thank you very much. Perhaps, Irina, another question.
Another question from Ukraine. What support have you received for professional media in your countries, which has proved really efficient? Because journalists are in a dialogue with the parliament in Ukraine to figure out what help could be the best for them.
Okay, right. Does anybody have, just raise your hand if anybody wishes to particularly respond. Coloreto, perhaps, have you had any support?
Yeah, I would say this, that our government decided not to support any journalist or media about the pandemic. So they supported other businesses, but not the media. But I know that there are different institutions, European organizations that have been offering help for the pandemic. But I really believe that we should go to what Alexandra was saying before, that we need to build sustainable models. So we can manage for a month or 2 or 3, even for 6 months with the help for the government. But we need to find other models of business models. And that needs to change. As now with the pandemic, it needs to change as fast as possible. So maybe we should be trying to identify other ways how to finance this media. As for the government, I don't know. I don't know what to suggest, but once the government gives money to you, it means that somehow they own you. And in countries like ours, at least I speak about Albania and Balkans, we are in the same boat here. I believe that the government will find the ways to differentiate in the help they are giving. So to give to their friendly media more money than to the critical media, etc., etc. So I don't believe that this can be a solution in the long run. We need strongly to discuss about the business model. Since this thing hit immediately, we need to discuss it immediately and try to adapt and change immediately. That's my feeling. Otherwise, we'll have, because in our countries here, there are no philanthropic institutions. So there are people who are giving money but not in a philanthropic way. They give money because they want something back. So they sort of own the media they are giving money to. So we need to work on that and talk and discuss much about that as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Irina?
Another question, have you seen any measures undertaken in your countries to promote media and public information literacy, especially in the situation of pandemic?
Yes, perhaps has anybody had such experience, media literacy being specifically promoted? Oksana, do you perhaps have anything to share from Ukrainian experience?
Well, we have initiatives on media literacy, but they are probably not on the governmental level. We have government Telegram channels set up by Health Ministry, but I can't say that this really works for media literacy, and unfortunately the influence of social networks is really huge, and I think we need initiatives implemented at the level of schools, and critical thinking should become probably one of the subjects, one of lessons that should be taught in schools nowadays. This is the way to solve it, because yes, we have plenty of NGOs in Ukraine who apply efforts, but of course they just cannot cover the whole situation. And yeah, media literacy, it's really very important. And one issue connected with media literacy is actually not only about like how to detect fakes, how to differ them, but also how to find how to differ good information. And the media literacy also means that you understand that you need this high quality information, and you have to support it probably somehow financially, maybe through some donation, whatever. You have to understand the importance of reliable information in times of like what not only now but every day. And I think we need not also
microphone. I'm sorry, Oksana, the microphone is, yes. Sorry, it wasn't working. The microphone, you were muted. So we haven't heard the last sentence we heard. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
We can hear.
We have initiative in Ukraine when we have like it's not the rating, it's a kind of initiative when different high reputed media, they get united around some obligations to keep balance, to provide reliable information. Like they say that you can trust us because we follow these transparent policies and you can trust us. I think such initiatives are very important. So not only to debunk fakes, but also to give knowledge to people. What is high quality information? Why do you need it? And that you have to support it.
Right. Thank you. Irina?
We have another question. Since we can expect a second wave of the pandemic this autumn, what shall media focus on in order to prepare better for this period?
Marco, I see a raised hand.
Yes, I have raised hand. Well, I think that is indeed an important question, because we need to be prepared for future waves, perhaps not just for the second wave of this virus, but perhaps for similar, or let's hope slightly weaker situations also in the future. What we have seen now is first that the media is already economically weak, and the crisis has weakened them even further. We need a very strong reaction from our governments first from the governments, simply to give the money and the funding to the media as a business and to the media employees as regular workers, so to speak. And then we need specific measures for the media and for the journalism because of the important role that they play. And I hope that the governments have seen now that they indeed play a very important role. The media newsrooms, of course, should in a way prepare the scenario for their future work in such conditions. They have, in a number of countries, performed very well to improvise all these sort of new journalistic production, conducting all these interviews through Zoom. We have seen footage of journalists broadcasting, so to speak, from their home, hosting whole news programs from their home, from their couch or bedroom. And there has been a lot of this improvisation and innovation and so on. What we need now is a sort of systematic approach to prepare the journalists and news workers, cameramen and so on to work in the future similar conditions. From the distance, having an appropriate equipment, better microphones to interview someone from 2 meters, for radio, for television, for online, to have all these sort of other technological equipment. We have seen our dilemmas and as in institutions and as well as education, what kind of platforms can we use to share the content? Is it Zoom? Is it Skype? Is it Blue Jeans and so on and so on? So this is a great occasion in a way of great. Of course, that this has been a sort of a very strong testing ground, but we need to also develop future tools for better handling all sort of crises, not just this one. But as a final say, if I may relate a bit to the economic issue, as I mentioned, we need quick responses. And the quickest response right now can be conducted through the government. The government can have special measures for the businesses and for the employees, but it should have special measures for the media as such. These measures should be non-discriminate, not to choose the platforms or the companies that they like, but to give the same stimulation to all the media companies, to all the journalistic sections, TV stations, not just to their favorable ones, to give, let's say, smaller VAT or to help them with the investment, with the infrastructure and so on. Then we need, of course, other measures. The government cannot help on its own. We do not have, as my colleague already said, philanthropy developed in a number of countries throughout the Europe and throughout the world, which means that sector is relatively weak in a number of countries, and the journalists cannot rely on that. That means we need additional measures. Paywalls will help to a certain extent, not enough, because in a number of cases these are small markets where you don't have audience that is big enough to finance you only from the market. This is not New York Times that can be spread throughout the world. These are countries, nation countries, producing content in languages for a few million people, and even if you have some people willing to pay, it probably will not be enough. I think it's also important to get some money, very simply to get the money from the social and other platforms. We have seen some discussions yesterday with Mark Zuckerberg, and I have seen some data from United Kingdom where the media companies, regarding the digital advertising, the media companies only get 4% of the whole digital advertising revenue. 96% goes to Google, Facebook, Amazon, and just a couple of others. Now that is amazing. I mean, of course, it's catastrophic for the media. And that is the level of concentration that we probably don't allow in any other aspect. So why do we allow that in terms of advertising? And the media, if media would raise from 4% to 40%, that would mean an increase of tenfold. So that would really help the media companies, which is actually producing the content that Google and Facebook are sharing. So we need a long list, but we need that very quickly in order for the media to be able to survive through also future crisis.
Thank you, Marko. Yes, indeed. I mean, there are so many pre-existing problems that are not COVID related specifically, but it's just that the urgency of the appropriate answers is now heightened because of COVID. Irina, we have a time for one more question, and then I'm sorry, we will, unfortunately, due to time constraints, have to, but give us another question.
Do you have any examples of authorities publishing proactively information of public interest during the crisis? I will repeat the question again. Do you have any examples of authorities publishing proactively information of public interest during the crisis?
Well, it is, yes, I also don't quite understand. I mean, obviously press conferences and continued dialogue is proactive publication of information in public interest to some extent, but how much more, or perhaps, what else could they be doing? What would be the optimum? Yes, Oksana, please.
I would like to mention one thing here. I'm afraid that we probably to mention it here. It's about actually we have now information heroes. We have journalists who put on layers of these protective clothes, and they go to hospitals and they to just make reports, socially important information about how, for instance, in Ukraine, it's very important to show how the real situation in hospitals looks like. And we have photo correspondents, we have operators, we have journalists who do really a heroic job. We have talked a lot about problems, but I would like also to praise these people who really risk their lives to collect information and to do it for the society. I think it maybe somehow answers these questions also.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, it really does. And now I would like to thank you all. Yes, time constraints have brought us to the end. One thing that I would like to say at the end is that while the Council of Europe itself cannot do very much in terms of providing funding, what we can do and are doing is providing standards on how the roles and responsibilities of states and media stakeholders should be divided and what kind of collaboration is expected, so that freedom of expression and media freedom would be advanced and human rights respected. Human rights of those producing media content and, of course, also of us who so gladly receive it. There is one particular instrument that I want to mention at the end that can be of some help, although it was drafted in the context of armed conflicts 13 years ago, guidelines on protecting freedom of expression and information in times of crisis. However, it has not lost either its topicality or the relevance also in the context of a health crisis. So this is something that can be consulted, and it is also something that can be used for dialogue with governments. In any event, we will of course continue working with you and hopefully for you. We hope to resume our discussions soon also in physical meetings. For the time being, I trust that we have shed some light on why freedom of expression and open deliberation in particular are so important, especially in these times. So thank you again. Thank you all panelists. Thank you all the participants who have submitted so many good questions, thought-provoking ones. I wish you all to stay well and stay safe, and obviously for journalists I also wish you to keep reporting for the common good. So thanks, this is all for today, and I wish to see you all soon, hopefully in Strasbourg as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.